Welcome to the Transmedia Tales panel. I am now going to go around the panelists and ask everybody to introduce themselves and tell us why they are on this Transmedia panel. So, Corey Brotherson, let's start with you.
Hi, so I am basically a narrative designer, but I also am a writer, editor, creative consultant. Many fingers in many pies. I actually started off as a games journalist kind of 19 years ago, and then through various sets of circumstances, I ended up working for PlayStation for about 12 years as a content producer on a PlayStation blog and PlayStation.com. So working on content for games such as Spider-Man and Horizon Zero Dawn. I became a freelance writer about a year ago. So now I am a narrative designer for Windrush Tales and a secret project which is wrapped up in NDAs, which I can't say much about. But I also write comic books. I've been writing comic books for about 15 years. Being kind of also contributing towards adapting screenplays to comic books as well. And I edit children's books for a publisher called Butterfly Books. So lots of different things.
Excellent, excellent. Rich Dansky.
Hi, I'm Richard Densky. I'm the Central Clancy writer for Ubisoft. Been with them for 21 years. I've also done 5 tie-in novels, and formerly I worked in the tabletop role-playing and LARP industries, which is about as productive as you'd imagine it to be.
Okay, and next is Leia Mwangamagui.
Hi, so I'm currently editor at Fusebox Games, and that means I'm across lots of projects and editing and writing, but also a tad of narrative design as well. I am a writer just generally as well, and similarly to Corey, I write graphic novels, I write animation. I am actually doing a PhD right now, writing a graphic novel, and during my master's at Central St Martin's, did a dramatic writing course where we wrote for various different mediums, so written plays, written TV, written film, and then also in my previous life wrote for various mediums, like an audio drama that you listened on the phone, radio, wrote a chatbot. So yeah, lots of different things, but I'm now here at Fusebox.
Excellent. And finally, Mikko Rotolahti.
Yeah. Hi. Like Corey, I also have a kind of dirty background in games journalism, and then at some point I kind of happened to end up on the other side of the fence, and I've been working in games for, I don't know, something like, must be coming up on 15 years now, and I am mostly a writer, I guess you could say, but I've also done a whole bunch of other stuff that's kind of related to narrative. And I assume that the biggest reason I'm here, I'm not actually sure, because like nobody ever said that this is the reason why we want you to be here, but I worked on a game called Quantum Break, and that had a major live action component in it. That you know, the game kind of it came bundled with a live action show, and it was kind of designed in a way that those two were like very much interlaced. I've also dabbled in like comic books and role-playing games and all sorts of other stuff, because that seems to be the thing people like us just have to do. But mostly I think that's probably the reason I'm here.
Excellent. All right. And I'm Anthony Johnston. I am, like many people on this panel, I do a lot of different things. I'm a graphic novelist, author, screenwriter, podcaster, musician, all manner of stuff. But in games, my career in games is intrinsically linked to Transmedia, because my first game, Dead Space, I got that gig because I was writing the Dead Space. I was hired to write the Dead Space spin-off comics, which was one of the first examples of what we think of as modern Transmedia. And that's why I am here. So let's start with a few general topics on the subject of Transmedia. I mean, probably, to my mind, and somebody like Rich might be able to correct me on this, but probably the first Transmedia spin-offs of TV and film, things like Star Trek and Star Wars. With games, I feel it may have been comics rather than novels, which led the way. But that's my memory. What I want to ask all you guys is, what is the earliest Transmedia that you remember encountering and thinking, oh, this is pretty cool? And Corey, let's start with you. Corey, you're muted. Hang on. I'll unmute you.
Hey, thank you. It's a great question. I think, trying to think back, a lot of the media that I was consuming at the time, there wasn't, I mean, I'm in my 40s now, and a lot of the stuff that I was encountering, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. Maybe from a purely kind of like adaptational point of view, you know, some of the basic stuff like some of the Star Trek games, and that was adapted from the TV series on top of that. But I think my very first one was potentially Shadowrun, which was a tabletop game which got turned into a video game and also a set of novels, but they were all locked into a certain universe, and they had the similar kind of ways of interacting with the characters, the way the characters were built, the character arcs themselves, and the plots, which was absolutely mind-blowing for me. And that was such an early example of what the potential of the different mediums being mixed together and merged together, that it has a massive influence on the way I wrote and the way I encountered media after that. I mean, one of the more memorable examples that passed from that was the Matrix, which really kind of interlocked with making sure that every single storyline was placed within either the anime or the film or the game. And obviously there was various successes and failures that came with that, which was always really interesting to learn. But I really found the courage of that project in itself was exceptionally inspiring.
Rich, how about you?
I would say for me it was the Star Trek, the animated series tie-in novels. And it was the first time I realized that the same story could be told different ways. I mean, I ate up the cartoon as a kid, and then suddenly there were books, and I was a rabid reader, and so just the realization that the same story could be told different ways, examining different viewpoints, and doing it in a way that added content depending upon the way you were telling the story. That was a mind blower for me, and I've been reading far too many tie-in novels ever since.
Leia, how about you? Oh, hang on, you're muted. Let me, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
I am. I was going to say, growing up in Kenya, I used to watch this cartoon called Super Strikers, and it was also a comic. But thinking about it, actually, the most impactful one was probably I did classics at university, and my dissertation was I read the Park Chan-wook film Old Boy as a Greek tragedy, because I saw sort of things in it, and I was trying to make it as interesting as possible. And I then found in a charity shop in Notting Hill, actually, the anime comics, and saw how different that was. But it was really interesting in reading it as a Greek tragedy, so like a very specific type of play, and the ways in which there you use words for like the meter of the poetry, and the words that you use will have like multiple meanings and stuff, and will evoke certain things. And then doing a close reading of the film, there were things that the director did and the set designer did and all the rest of it that replicated that, but in a completely different medium, obviously in film. But it was the same sensibility of having a specific color palette for a character or a mood, or like how the storytelling was fundamentally about guiding you as a viewer using all the tools in your toolbox. So yeah, that's probably the most impactful one, was seeing, oh wow, you can have a story told in various different ways, and the medium that you use will be heightened, rather the story be heightened by the media that you use. But yeah, that's the first one, Old Boy.
Wow. Interesting subject for a dissertation. Miko, how about you?
Well, I think the earliest actually game-related piece of Transmedia, the very first one would have been something like, Star Wars comics or something like that. But The first one that was related to a game is kind of a weird one, I think. There's this 1985 game called Everyone's a Wally by Microgen that was made for the Spectrum and Commodore 64 and maybe some other platforms as well. And it's it's not a terribly remarkable game, I guess. It did a couple of things that hadn't been done before, like you had multiple characters that you could control, which I think was the first time that had ever actually been done in a game before. But because this was 1985, the game actually came on a cassette. So one side of the cassette had the game, and the other side had a song called "Everyone's a Wally." This is something you can Google. It's this weird like song about the characters in the game and how they're kind of like trying to fix up a house, and it turns into a horrible mess. And I had never seen something like that before, or like heard something like that before. And this was kind of complicated by the fact that I'm from Finland. Like English is not my first language, and I am very comfortable with it now. I can tell you that 1985 was not a year of English for me. So I understood very little of it, but I was absolutely fascinated by it. And in my imagination, somehow the song was totally about like what the game actually is about, which is sort of, I guess it's sort of related to fixing up a house, but it's a very arcade game where, you go around and jump around and try not to get hit by things. So yeah, that was my first encounter. I would like to think that we have kind of progressed slightly since those days, but sometimes I just like Google it up and listen to it all over again, and I kind of love it.
That sounds very strange. Yeah, mine was probably the one that had the most impact on me was the old West End Games Star Wars tabletop role-playing game, which was a wonderful role-playing system, but also the way it was designed was that it focused, much like the recent series The Mandalorian, it focused on the edges of the Star Wars universe. It wasn't all about the Jedi and the central characters. And that really opened up my eyes to, like Corey was saying, to the possibilities of looking at the way things interlinked and looking at the edges of a property and finding the interesting things there. That had a really big impact on how I approach transmedia. Another one that I just briefly want to mention that I just remembered as we were talking about this is when I was a child, we had a toy over here called Action Man. If you're not familiar with Action Man, think of something like G.I. Joe, but themed around the British Army. And there were Action Man spin-off novels that I remember reading as a child. They're very, very short, like 30,000 word novels. And they were quite good, or at least they were when I was, 10 years old. I remember enjoying those. But anyway, so we're here to talk about games. Now, most modern games transmedia, certainly that I'm aware of, directly ties into a game story. The game is the central property and the transmedia is everything else around it. And it often ties directly to an installment of that game as a prequel or a sequel, or sometimes both. I mean, I did a Dead Space comic that took place between the first two games, for example. If it's a game story that you weren't involved with, how do you go about approaching that? If you're hired to work on something where you aren't also writing the game, how can we approach that to get the most out of it? And I'll go around again. Corey.
I think it's one of those situations where I think the bad thing about having this sort of transmedia is there's always the lack of accessibility. There's always a danger of having a property which is so expansive and so unwieldy that you want to introduce as many people as possible, but you can't actually bring in certain characters because it just becomes too obtrusive to suddenly stop the narrative and then suddenly kind of say, well, this character's from this particular part of transmedia and this character's from another particular part of transmedia. But kind of going back to that, sorry, can you just repeat the last part of your question? Because
I was just saying, how do you approach it if it's something that you weren't involved? We can all imagine, and I'm sure we've all done transmedia where we're involved in the game, and therefore we can both tailor one to the other. But if you're where you weren't involved in writing the game, how can you take advantage of that to get something rich out of a transmedia property?
I think it's amazing to be able to, like you're saying, if you're working on the outside, the outskirts of the property itself, I think looking at that as an advantage rather than a hindrance or any sort of burden is probably key to that. I think the excitement, I know a lot of my friends who work in writing, they're absolutely terrified at a blank page. And for me, that is the most exciting part, because nothing is solid and you can play around with ideas. And I think that's very much the same when it comes to approaching that sort of level of transmedia, where you have the spine of narrative, which is there, which is pre-existing, and the ability to kind of say, well, okay, I can't actually touch maybe the main protagonist, the central protagonist of that particular part of the story, but I can tell a story which is really interesting and revolves around other characters and make them the central part of that. I think exploring that sort of potential, exploring the excitement that comes from that is actually key. Not necessarily even just to, into answering your question, but when it comes to any type of narrative at all, having that ability to kind of pull something out, and you can get some absolutely incredible, fascinating stories when you create a character which is and a character arc which ties in nicely to the central spine of the story that you can't touch, and create something which ends up being a lot more richer in the process.
Rich, I'm going to skip you for a moment because I want to come to you last on this question for what I hope are obvious reasons. Leia, how about you? How do you approach, making a rich transmedia property?
Using this game as a central,
yeah,
or any property.
Well, no, for a game specifically.
Well, I think it's about, I guess, isolating what's most attractive to the audience about the property, about the game, and making sure you understand like what was the intent, like what's the values around behind the narrative of the game, and then like you were saying, mining the edges of the world for characters that are underexplored or that are new, and cleaving those two things together. So I think it's not the only thing you're kind of slavishly tied to is what the sensibility of the world is and what the kind of fundamental values of it are. And then beyond that, like, as I was saying before, just really running with the medium rather that you're in, and finding pockets that are unexplored, so you haven't got sort of an audience who are like, oh, it didn't go like that. You can finding some way to be free, but like just aligning yourself with what the original property intended.
An audience saying that it didn't happen that way, surely that never happens. Miko, how about you?
Well, I kind of feel like there are like two things that are kind of really interesting about transmedia. The first one is that it's an opportunity to do, something that they just didn't have really space to do in the sort of like main storyline. If you're making a game and it's, I don't know, let's say 8 hours of gameplay, there's going to be a lot of stuff in there that you really can't explore, but you are still kind of introduced into it. So you can do a lot of stuff that I think is very interesting and kind of ties into the existing experience in ways that can be kind of unexpected and interesting, and especially if you are like a big fan of the original thing, it can be something that gives you like something that you can really sink your teeth into. Like maybe it's a side character that you kind of like, and you can get a lot more out of him, or maybe it's something that just kind of is more like a piece of world building than something that really concentrates on like specific characters. The other thing is that video game storytelling is often a little bit weird in that if you compare it to movies, like anything that is super cheap in a movie is super expensive in a video game, and often quite the other way around. So if you have like a scene that has like two people talking and they're like passing a cigarette back and forth, you can hear the anguish cries of like 1,000 animators right there. Whereas if you want to blow up a car, it's just kind of like, well, that we have in the library. Like, how many do you want? And that kind of means that because there are these certain technical limitations and practical things, a lot of transmedia is often a great opportunity to just do stuff that you really can't do in the main game, and you know, that kind of can give you kind of like a more rounded out, more interesting overall experience for that franchise, and I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that attracts, the main thing that attracts me to Transmedia is the freedom to, as you say, and as we've all said, to explore things that aren't necessarily in the game, but also to take an approach that isn't necessarily in the game, because the Transmedia isn't the main selling points, because it isn't what people are, you know, mostly concerned about with the property. You can do some strange and weird things and some very, very creatively freeing things, because it almost doesn't matter if it gains mass acceptance so long as it supports the game. And that's where I want to come to you, Rich Dansky, because you work on, you know, one of the biggest franchises in video games, and you have written several, I believe, tie-ins to those video games, but they're not, correct me if I'm wrong, adaptations. They are tie-in Transmedia novels. So how on earth do you approach that when they're based on the work of a novelist to begin with?
The fortunate thing is that the work of Mr. Clancy has such clear and strong signposts that it's very easy to say, okay, this fits in his world, this doesn't. This is something that makes sense as being under the Clancy banner. This is something that doesn't. And so that was always a guideline, creating stories that weren't directly adapted from the books. The very few of the games are actually directly adapted from novels by Mr. Clancy. Most of them we came up with our own stories and just very carefully gut check them against what the brand was, what the fictional universe would support, and make sure that what we did was something that would speak to the fans as belonging. And then turning that around, writing the Ghost Recon novel, Dark Waters, that was an interesting case because I was specifically asked to bolt directly onto the narrative spine of the game to show the team coming together for the first time. So I got to play with the major characters. I got to play with the big themes and the big storylines. And so it was almost a case of reverse engineering. Okay, what's the stuff we took out of the novels? Let's put that back in. And what can I do in a novel that I can't do in a game? And the answer turned out to be telling lots of short interconnected stories that led to one big finale, as opposed to doing one overarching narrative, which is what you get in a game.
I think that's a really important point that we've all made, and that really needs to be reiterated for anybody out there watching who is considering getting into, you know, Transmedia or looking to get hired for that sort of thing, is, as you said, the ability to do things that you can't do in the game, and, as Leia said, to take advantage of the medium in which you're working. You know, there are many things you can do in a novel that you simply can't do in a game, and vice versa. And same with graphic novels, same with audio dramas, whatever it may be. They all have their own strengths, and playing to those strengths is, I think, key to making good Transmedia. The philosophy we had on Dead Space, and the whole reason actually that I took on the original comic spin-off gig to start with, when I had my call with them, one of the things I said was, if you're going to do this, it has to be a good comic series. It can't just be an okay comic series that supports a really good game. It has to stand by itself as a really good comic series. And if you're committed to that, then, you know, I'm on board, I'll do it. And they were, thank goodness. And we did get, you know, we came up with something that stands by itself. And if I do say so myself, you know, it is a quality comic that doesn't rely on the game for people to sort of look upon it fondly. And I think that's, as long as we can keep that in mind, then, you know, as long as the intentions are pure, then I think, you know, you will always at least come up with something interesting and good quality. And then it's in the hands of the audience and the lap of the gods, as we all know, as to how something like that is received. So let's talk briefly about movie adaptations, not strictly Transmedia as we define it now, but obviously they are something that are on a lot of people's minds. They raise the profile of and I hope this isn't too controversial, I think it's fair to say there still hasn't been a truly great movie adaptation of a game. We may all have our favorites. I personally think the first Silent Hill movie comes closest, but even that, you know, has its problems. Why is this so difficult? I'm going to start with Mikko, because you did the live action, as you said, the live action television program portions of Quantum Break. So, and obviously that's not an adaptation, that was a continuation of the story. But having worked in that medium, why do you think it's so difficult to get a good adaptation of a video game onto the screen?
Well, first of all, I should point out that I definitely worked on the show, but at a bit of a remove. It wasn't produced by us at Remedy, which is where I was working at the time, and I didn't actually get to write it personally. And I'm going to be a little bit blunt and say that one reason why it didn't reach its full potential was because we didn't actually get to write it ourselves. As you know, it's one of those things where I think there were like a lot of sort of conflicting ambitions in the project. First of all, you know, we were trying to make the game, other people were trying to make the show, and even though they were all kind of to be delivered as part of the same package, the people who were working on the show really didn't have, you know, a very strong commitment to the game. You know, they didn't, many of them didn't really know anything about the game. They didn't really care that much about the game. It was, if you know, I know that a lot of them kind of felt that it was something that was kind of, they felt that it kind of restricted them and kept them from doing the stuff that they wanted to do, because there were, you know, a lot of things that they just obviously couldn't get, you know, do at all, because it was so closely tied to what was happening in the game. So a lot of the creative energy that could have been spent on making it better was actually spent on just like navigating these kind of like friction points. And I think that is, even that's a kind of like a unique case. I think that's something that is at the heart of like a lot of these adaptations, is that the people who make them don't generally really care about the product. Like they know that it's a big franchise. They know that there is value in the IP recognition, you know, like that's something that they want to, you know, capitalize on. But they firmly believe that whatever they want to do is better than what was there originally. And I think there is kind of like an existing parallel of you know, like a genre that kind of was struggling with that for many years, and then suddenly got over that, and that would be like superhero films, which for a, you know, decades, whenever they made one, they would always be bad. Even the ones that were pretty good were always just kind of wrong. You know, like on a fundamental level, you know, if you look at something like Tim Burton's Batman, which I quite like, I think it's a pretty solid film, but it's not a great Batman film, all things considered. It's like a Tim Burton circus extravaganza where Batman goes around and like blows people up using a drone car. And it's kind of like, that's not really sort of in the heart of the Batman experience for me. And you know, they kept on doing that over and over and over again until, you know, somebody was in a position to actually kind of put their foot down and they'll go like, no, like we own this material. We know exactly how it should be treated, and we're now going to do that. And that's how we got the, you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is, you know, there's a lot you can criticize about that, but if you are a fan of, say, Captain America or Ant-Man or any one of those characters, like you can just go into it and it feels like it's the real thing. I mean, it's been adapted, obviously. It's not identical, but, you know, it feels like it's got the same spirit. And it's like 90% of the experience is what you would want it to be. And we don't have that in video games at all, like not even a little bit.
We don't. I mean, one of the advantages that they have with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, of course, is that they are adapting from a pool of stories, but they're all linear stories. They're not interactive stories, and they don't therefore have the requirements of interactive stories, which I think is one of the issues. Leia, you've worked in, you know, many different media as well. What do you think about this?
I was thinking about it. I think I've been thinking a lot at the moment about the emotional experience of playing games. And what I think is that there's a disconnect from the experience of playing a game where you have agency and the feelings that are evoked playing that game. And also, as Mika was saying, like, I forget who was saying, that you have your 8 hours of gameplay, you can go into various different places, all the rest of it. And then a linear film that might be, you know, 2 hours long, or even a TV show it still won't replicate the idea of you having agency. And I think maybe what it is apart from, you know, your bog standard politics around an IP and a franchise and people who have like different ownerships and whatever, there's also, if you try to replicate a game playing experience with a movie experience, it's never gonna go. So I think there is an element of needing to like back away and, sorry, this is probably going to be my like mantra, should get a t-shirt, embrace the medium. I think the failures are always about like, oh, Pacific Rim isn't a game. Anyway, but like, let's say there's a game where loads of blowing up and whatever, or with Assassin's Creed, it's this is the gameplay. We're gonna just try to replicate that and put it on the screen, and everything will be fine. It's like, no, you kind of have to get your Christopher Nolan, an auteur, to be like, I have something very specific that I want to say with this property in this specific medium. I fully align with what the, you know, underlying values of the initial property were, but I'm not going to try to pretend to be something else, because the audience will just be unsatisfied. They're like, this isn't a film. This is a good film. This isn't a good game. Why am I here? So yeah, I think it's a lot about letting go of trying to replicate an emotional experience that you just can't.
Yeah, I think once again, this returns us to the idea of taking advantage of the medium you're in. And in games, what you can do that no other media can do is immersion, you know, have that agency and that emotional connection to making the decisions yourself, which, as you say, you simply can't do in any other medium. Rich, what are your thoughts on this? Why is it so difficult? Hang on, you're muted. There you go.
I'm back. There we go. I think it's a question over what you do in a movie or a television show versus what you do in a game. In a game, you are basically talking nonstop action. The talking breaks are few and far between. That is, if creative direction lets you get away with something that isn't action, as opposed to a movie or a television show, where the violence is spread out, it is used to effect, it is used for spectacle, but it is not the oxygen that the product is breathing every single moment. And so understanding what to take from games where you don't have to satisfy that gameplay requirement, where you don't have to satisfy the need for immersion every single second, and providing something that can be a good supporting post for a movie or a television or novel story, it's a very difficult task. And getting away from the moments where you just say, okay, well, we'll add 10 more guys to the fight scene here to extend gameplay, and instead coming up with something that is a genuinely human moment. Those are very, very different things, and the human moments sometimes have been very hard to find in games.
That is true, although obviously that's something that's changing as time goes on. It does make you wonder if this is a generational thing. I mean, I know a lot of people in LA who work in movies but love games. They love games and play games all the time, and yet they still have this problem. And I do wonder if it's going to take, because they're all about my age, so we grew up with video games. I do wonder if it's going to take another couple of generations to get to people for whom games is just, it's, you know, it's what they do. They've never known a world without good quality, immersive, narrative heavy video games, and maybe those will help them get over this issue. But I mean, you know, it's maybe not. Maybe it's just a sort of intrinsic problem. Corey, have you come across this? Because again, you've worked across all these different media.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone's been saying. I think when you saw the earlier video game adaptations to movies, there was always this trend to take very kind of like popular games, Mario, Sonic, that didn't necessarily have character arcs, and trying to create lore and character arcs around these characters which exist merely for the fact that, you know, around the gameplay is exceptionally difficult, especially when you have that disconnect between the game developers and the filmmakers. And I think it's no coincidence that you're starting to see more of that connection between the development of on-screen media like Witcher, where there's such a deep lore, such a deep amount of story there, which has been successful by comparison, and the likes of like The Last of Us being created into a movie where Neil Druckmann is being brought into that process as well to really help solidify the fact that it is story-driven. I think one of the things as well that isn't really talked about very much when it comes to this sort of thing is that when we're creating games, I think audiences don't necessarily always realize that we're creating games, especially narrative-driven games, from the perspective of two different genres. We're having to deal with the genre of the gameplay, but also the genre of the actual narrative itself. And that's one of the reasons why some games can be absolutely incredible, because you really get this mesh of the genres where, for example, you know, with The Last of Us, you have you know, a stealth action game essentially, which is kind of tied into this thriller horror, and it works really well. It's very difficult to sometimes divorce those two elements if they're not quite connecting and put them into a film or a TV series. And that's one of the advantages of games in itself, because when you do have that disconnect and it works really well, then you have something like Untitled Goose Simulator, which is essentially a stealth puzzle game, but it's also a family kids comedy in the mold of like Peter Rabbit or Dennis the Menace. You're effectively playing a naughty goose going around causing absolute chaos in a small town. And again, if you were to transpose that and put that into a movie or a film, a movie or a TV series rather, you would probably struggle to a certain degree, because you would then having to kind of understand, where did the goose come from? Why is the goose doing all these things? And that space of narrative that exists when it comes to games like that is what the player brings to the game, which individually makes it more emotionally resonant to the player. Whereas a movie or TV series, they don't quite have that luxury. They're having to explain all these bits of elements that the audience will come to it and expect to be there for them to discover.
Yeah, it's very difficult to discover something for yourself when you're watching a TV show or a movie or something, as opposed to the way you can in a game. We've just taken a poll of all the people in the audience, by the way, and I'll just note, the question was, which media would you like to work in? It was multiple choice. Naturally, as you'd expect, the vast majority of people responding said video games, but also an awful lot of them said film. Again, you might expect that. As did the same number of people said novels, which I'm genuinely pleased and surprised by. It's good to know that there are still people out there who want to write novels. Thank you. So, Corey, I'm going to stick with you for a moment. Then, simple question: what makes for successful transmedia, and what is the best example that you can think of right now?
Successful transmedia for me, I think, is having that, I hate this word, and you can tell I've worked in marketing for 12 years, synergy between the properties. It is something which, and it's a terrible buzzword, but it does, I think, accurately describe what the successful transmedia is all about. And it really brings that element of exciting the audience from one media and making them want to explore the other media at the same time. There is always a danger and there's always a problem of it being difficult to create that sense of energy between the media, and always kind of like allow that that level of the bridging gaps, and also the way that some people may necessarily not be attracted to certain types of media as well. I know a lot of people, going back to The Matrix, I know a lot of people that absolutely adored the movies. They had no interest in comic books or anime because for them, it wasn't the sort of media that they consume, typically speaking. And so when it came back to the movies and certain characters being introduced, they were like, oh, who's this character? What's going on here? I don't quite understand this. But ultimately, it's basically the platform, but also the massive attraction of creating successful transmedia, and doing that and making it accessible for people is definitely one of the big things. As you know, having written comic books are exceptionally difficult to buy and for availability for a lot of people, a lot of the audiences. So it is always a bit of a trapdoor. But I think kind of tapping into that and making sure that the stories, yes, they work individually, but also have that level of connection and real kind of interest across them is absolutely fundamental. And the more interesting you make it for those individual characters to stand alone, but also enriching the rest of the media, then the more successful it would be. In terms of successful examples, it's actually quite a difficult question for me to answer. I'm trying to.
Just one.
I'm trying to think. Oh, go ahead, Leia.
I was going to say I've got 3 examples, but I've forgotten the first part of the question, so I can give my examples while you're thinking.
The question was just,
go ahead.
The question was just what makes for successful transmedia, but then in light of that, what do you think are the best examples? So answer it in any order you like.
I'll refer again to my T-shirt. It is about embracing the medium, and I really loved. There was a Wolverine audio drama, a podcast. And it was just brilliant, like the use of sort of sound and the way that it was edited and stuff. It was just so brilliant. So that would be one. And another one, I have a 5-year-old, so these are my examples. But there's a French video game called Wakfu, and on Netflix you will find the first 3 seasons of it as an animation, and it's really good. And I didn't know it was a video game until we're like halfway through. I'm like, how is this world so intricate and well designed? And it's like a quest, so they're going around, but it was just so well done. So I was like, there's just no way it can be this one thing. And then realized that there was a game as well. I was like, that'll make sense. The last one is my favorite property ever, Avatar: The Last Airbender, the cartoon. Is actually a really good example of a terrible transmedia product and a brilliant one. The comics are wonderful. The film was not. And I have my fingers crossed for the Netflix television adaptation. But the creators of Avatar, the cartoon, were heavily involved in the comics, and were not so much involved with the film, and are now going to be involved with the TV show. So hopefully that is the just that creative cohesion is possibly the secret sauce. But yeah, those are the 3 that I really liked.
I think one of the other points to take from this, and this is the reason why I asked about movies earlier, because I think it's, in general, speaking generally, probably easier to make a good TV show from a game than a movie, simply because there is so much to it. As we've all said, there is so much in a game. There's hours and hours of gameplay. There's so much work that goes into the world building of each game that, as Corey mentioned, The Witcher, for example, it's so much easier to explore that successfully and not make it feel forced, like you're cramming everything into 90 minutes or, these days, 2.5 hours. But that's still not long enough. And so I think it is probably easier to make a TV show like, as you said, Avatar started out as a TV show, but it's, or like that French adaptation, because there's just so much more room for everything to breathe. Let's go to Miko next. Miko, what's your example of really good transmedia?
Well, I think these are kind of, in some ways, I guess this is like a really obvious one. All the Lego stuff. Like, I think they're a great example of the kind of thing where they have taken like any number of really sort of like classic IPs. They got Star Wars. The Lego movie is like this mad scramble of every IP imaginable, pretty much. And like they have just thrown the whole thing together, and it's something that is generally pretty faithful to the original IPs, but at the same time it's also very decidedly like a Lego thing. It's something that is very clearly built on the Lego aesthetic and not on the, say, Batman aesthetic. And in fact, all of them are kind of like parodies of the real thing, but kind of very, very loving parodies. I think that's kind of, in some ways I feel like that's kind of like the purest example of a certain kind of transmedia thing, in that it is very clearly an adaptation through and through, but at the same time, at least the successful examples of that are something that always takes the source material very seriously, and they may be kind of laughing with it a little bit, but they're never really, like, they're not mocking it in any kind of way. Like there is no condescension towards it, and I think that's a kind of a key thing.
Yeah, that's a really good example, actually. Yeah, Rich, how about? Oh no, good. Corey, have you finally thought of something? Go on.
I have finally, and I can't believe I didn't think of this at first. Sorry, Richard. Star Wars, and when I say Star Wars, I actually mean the more recent versions of that, because obviously when Disney bought LucasArts and Lucasfilm, they started actually creating a lot of interconnecting stuff, which everything was in canon. So the Star Wars films were suddenly talking to the Star Wars comics, which were also talking to the Star Wars games as well. And there'll just be some really, really great kind of merging of those, where you read like a Jason Aaron or Kieran Gillen Star Wars comic, and then all of a sudden you would see some of those elements coming to The Force Awakens or what have you, and it's very, very new. But it's actually, I think it's a fantastic example of how to be able to move all those things together, because there was obviously one particular hub which was acting as a go-between between each and every single property, and because it's such a massive property as well, I think it worked exceptionally well.
That was actually going to be the example that I gave as well. Was all the,
sorry.
No, that's fine. The decades of Star Wars transmedia that we've had, which has varied in quality, but we have had some absolutely outstanding stuff come out of that. And my favorite current example would be the Mandalorian TV show, which I think is just absolutely superb. Rich, what's your best example of successful transmedia?
No, I want to take the panel and start arguing about Star Wars now. I'm actually going to go for a deep cut here and see if anybody remembers a TV show called Heroes.
Yes.
Which had brilliant transmedia after its first season. Its second season, it went some strange places, but it had a great television series for the first season. It had comic books that expanded the universe without requiring you to have had to watch the TV series to get what was going on. It even had a romance novel. And those were all stories that could be told in that same universe that added to the whole, added to the sum of the parts, as opposed to being necessary for you to understand what was going on. So you could take your enjoyment where you could find it in that universe, and you could add more, or you could just stop with the things that you liked. But I thought they did a brilliant job of setting up a transmedia framework that they unfortunately failed to follow through with.
Yeah, well, and I think that a lot of that's just down to the again, this comes to the core, the question of what is core. And in that case, it was the TV show. And unfortunately, the second season of the show was, creatively, you could argue, unsuccessful. And certainly in terms of audience figures, very unsuccessful, and reaction, very unsuccessful. And that, I think, it takes a very, very strong property to live on after the core element is, has a failure of that magnitude. Leia, go on. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, not to plug it, well, to plug it, because I work for Fusebox, but something Richard just said about not needing prior knowledge of the property to fully enjoy it. Like, it's great, you'll get Easter eggs, if you did enjoy it, but it's not excluding a new audience who will just come to the property. I do think Love Island, the game, has done very well on that, because most of our players are not familiar with the IP. They're not familiar with the television show, and most of the players don't actually come from the UK. So I am quite proud of the team that I work with. I've just been there since February, so we'll see how we go. But it is quite remarkable what how people have been able to enjoy it without having any of the understandings of the mechanics of the original IP. And I think that is down to this idea of inviting people in and then expanding on what the primary structure of it was. So yes, that is my fourth example for you.
Raise for you. Right, I'm going to turn this to our audience questions now. And here's a good one from an anonymous attendee. How often, typically, would a game's story and world be tailored towards portability to other media, such as tie-in novels, as well as the game itself? And are you asked to think about those connections from the start? Rich, I think you're in a good position to start us off on this one.
I have been on projects where I've been told to think about that from the get-go. I have been on projects where I've been told not to worry about it at all. It really depends on the company's goals at the time and who they're talking to and what they want to do with that game. But it can be very creatively rewarding to think about the transmedia elements from the get-go and leave hooks in the game for those other stories to be told, for other people to latch onto what you're building and create a stronger, broader edifice.
I think leaving hooks is exactly the way to put it when you approach it from that basis of, okay, we know this is going to be transmedia. Make sure there's enough there that, as you say, other media can latch onto and draw something out. Anybody else on the panel have an answer for that one?
I do. If
Yeah,
anyone has it. Yeah, so I was thinking, actually looking at the poll of what's easiest to translate, I noticed that theatre didn't have one to TV. It may have done, but I didn't see it. But I'm just thinking, at the forefront of my mind are two properties, Fleabag and I May Destroy, well, She Made I May Destroy You, which is incredible. Everyone should watch that. But also Chewing Gum. And both of those were adapted from One Woman shows, stage productions. And they were then approached by TV companies to expand, the very sort of dense storytelling into a television universe. And so I think, and in thinking about their ages and the environment they grow up in, I think you were talking about generational changes. I wonder that one of them is, if you grow up in an environment where you constantly see properties going from various different mediums constantly, as a writer, when you start to write a story, if it be a novel, a short story, a play, or whatever, I think you just kind of automatically might have it in the back of your mind that wherever I take this to, well, certainly I've started to do that. And I don't know if it's because the writing course, as I said, the MA that I did, dramatic writing, was very much about there's like core elements to storytelling, but then think about what's the best medium to tell this story, but you will still be able to change it into other things. Like I've made a play into a TV show, into an audio drama, into a whatever, because I'm not limited by thinking, oh, it's only going to be a game, it's only going to be whatever. So I wonder if it's the question was, do you think about that from the beginning? I wonder that it's become unconscious now that you create a property that's got a big enough world it can be taken anywhere.
You may well be right. Yeah, I think the pitfall to watch out for there, as we've all really talked about, and I mentioned specifically earlier, is to make sure that whatever you're doing is a good piece of work in the medium in which you're working. And this is something that I've definitely seen, and I'm sure Corey will as well, in comic books. There was a fad, shall we call it, in the sort of mid 2000s for what were basically screenplays that wouldn't sell being rewritten as comic books, with the express intent of them being optioned by Hollywood back into movies and adapted to screenplays. And they could go, here's one I prepared earlier. And most of them, as a result, I'm sorry to say, without naming any names, were dreadful comics because they were never designed to be comics. So I think you're absolutely right that I think more people are probably approaching the way they tell stories with an idea that something could be transmedia. But for everybody out there watching this and listening to this, I just want to urge you, please make sure that it is also a good play, comic book, story, whatever that you do first. Just make sure it's good, because that's really more important. Anybody else want to jump in on that before I move on?
No? I'll quickly say something. I can't say about one of the things because you probably hear a high-pitched whine of the laser being pointed at my house by one of the NDAs that I'm currently under. But when I was writing Windrush Tales, there was in the back of my mind as a narrative piece, even though it was text-based when we started kind of putting it together with Shella Ramanan. And it was always kind of like thinking about, what could we do to potentially expand that, because there have been no games which have dealt with Windrush before. So automatically we were kind of like being told, oh, well, you know, how do you feel about doing like a book or doing something else which may kind of tie into that? And it really kind of allowed us to broaden how we feel and how we think about creating these sort of tales, these sort of stories. Funnily enough as well, just kind of flipping that a little bit, one of the properties that I work on, Clockwork Watch, which is owned by a very close friend, Transmedia expert Yomi Ayani, that was designed to be a screenplay and ended up being a comic book first, with the idea of making it also into games. But we also did like live events which had actors involved in it, and where their actions in the live events were then fed into the comic books as a result, even though they were totally spontaneous, we had nothing to do with them, which led to some interesting kind of branches of narrative. But because it was always designed to be a transmedia property from the very, very start, we always had those hooks in mind of how we were going to design it. It just so happened that we wanted it to be participatory. So we had people that were actively contributing towards that and allowing us to spring off that as a result.
Okay, I've just been asked by Andy Walsh, our person in charge, that to let everybody know that we are going to run this over by 10 minutes. Let's be honest, it'll probably be more like 15, to compensate for the delayed start and the problems that we had. So everybody, please do stick with us. So now I want to move on to a simple question, but one that is important, which is, what should a good transmedia portfolio look like as a newcomer, presumably meaning a newcomer to games? Rich, I want to point this one at you, because you're one of the people on this panel who's in a position to hire writers. So what do you look for in portfolios?
What I look for in portfolios is understanding of the mediums that you're working in. I've gotten resumes with writing samples for game writers where the sample was 200 pages worth of novel that was clearly an adapted Dungeons and Dragons campaign. And that did not demonstrate any facility for game writing. So if you're trying to build a transmedia portfolio, yes, have some fiction. Yes, have some screenplay material in there. Yes, have some game writing that's specific stuff. You know, even go crazy and do some systemic writing and demonstrate that you understand the different types of medium and the demands and the necessities of those specific mediums before you plunge into them head first.
Yeah, it's, again, talk about, you know, writing to the strengths of your medium. Yeah, very important. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Go ahead, Mika.
Yeah, I think another thing is just on a practical level, wherever you're applying, it's, you know, you kind of have to do your basic research and just figure out, like, what is it that this company is doing? You know, if they're making just like straight up action games, and you have your I don't know, like super artsy experimental play, including that in there, like there is a chance that somebody who's going to look at it is going to be able to sort of see your beautiful soul through the whole thing and understand how you can apply that to, you know, all of these action stuff that they're making. But most likely that's not going to happen. And, you know, like, you kind of have to sort of tailor your approach to whatever company you're working with, at least to some degree. And of course, like, this also goes the other way around. Like, if all you have is just a bunch of like jokes about like killing people and like breaking bones, and you know, you are applying to a company that makes so-called walking simulators, probably not the impression you want to make. Like, it's not just about the quality of the work, it's also about like what kind of sensibilities and judgment you present. And I think in a lot of cases that may actually even be more important than whether or not your work is good, because it's kind of assumed that a lot of the stuff that comes in is good, but that's not really the only thing that matters there.
Leia, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I didn't think I had anything, but thinking about the portfolio I put together for my MA, we chose, so I think the other thing as well is, conversely to understanding the company you're going to, understand yourself as well. Like, if you don't want to do a certain thing, that's cool. I think all writers nowadays have to put together a portfolio career, but take the time to figure out what you actually enjoy. Because there might be challenges that you're like, oh, allow that, and that's totally fair. But yeah, just take time to figure out what you would actually want to do, as opposed to what's shiny, particularly as a newcomer. It shouldn't just be about, oh, everyone's going over there, I should do this, this, and this. You'll be limited. This is a marathon, not a sprint. So really just take time to dig into does this thing excite me? Do I want to learn more about it? Do I want to get good at these mediums, and put those in your portfolio?
Yeah, I think that's very important. Just generally, frankly, in any kind of creative career, is to know when you're just not into something. That's okay. You don't have to do everything. I just wanted to mention, Mika reminded me of something. I went to art college to study graphic design, and I'll always remember one of my lecturers saying to me once, we're not necessarily, because we were complaining that we weren't getting it. This was back when computers were still very new in the graphic design industry, and a lot of us were complaining that we weren't getting enough time on the computers learning how to use the software. And he said, we're not here to teach you how to use Photoshop, we're here to teach you how to think. And if you can do that, you can learn Photoshop in a day and apply what you've learned here to to using that tool. And I think that does apply to writing in a sense as well, and especially to transmedia, because if you know how stories are put together, if you know what makes a good character, then you can apply that to other media by studying those media and figuring out how they approach those things. You can learn how to write a screenplay. You can learn even how to write a game relatively easily in terms of just the mechanics. What takes years is knowing what makes a good story and how to write a good character, on what makes good story conflict and all that sort of stuff. And that comes with time, experience, taste. That's what makes you unique and different to everyone else. And that is just as important, I think, in your portfolio as showing the ability to follow screenplay format or something, which really, like I say, you can learn that in a day.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think just in general, the media you consume is really important, and you should really, obviously, if you are a writer, you have to sort of immerse yourself in all sorts of writing, but just kind of on a general level, if you want to work in video games and all you ever do is play video games, you are already making a pretty bad mistake. Like you should be reading books, you should be watching plays, and just you should be like a sponge for that sort of thing, and not just experience the things that you're going to like. You should try to get a little bit more experimental about it, and learn to be analytical. But okay, so this happened, this character said this thing, what would change if they had said it differently, that kind of thing. You have to really get into that kind of mindset, because that's really the key to understanding how to actually produce that material yourself.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to put us all on the spot here with a question that I quite like, actually. We talked about, and I said this in response to something Rich said about leaving hooks in when you build a world and in a game narrative and stuff that other elements can pick on. So one of the audience asks, can we give some examples of these hooks that can be left to make translation into other transmedia easier, either for yourself or for another writer that comes along? Corey, I'll start with you.
You threw me right into that one. Yeah, it's, I think, thinking broadly, one easy way, and it does take a little bit of planning in one respect, but one easy way is being able to think about your endings. So, for example, when I was first writing my first few comic books and I started writing for a publisher, one of the things that I was told was always to think about potential spin-offs and sequels. And that kind of was ingrained in me when I carried on writing for the rest of my stuff. And thinking about endings and thinking about okay, so these characters have had their character arcs fulfilled. Are they hiding a secret? It's always the you know, the saying of, you know, all your characters will maybe have one secret. Are they hiding a secret from one of the other main characters? Is that something that you can use to then expand on that? Is there another character which has come into the story and has fulfilled their purpose in the story, but not necessarily being fleshed out to the point where you can say, oh, okay, they've had their own individual character arc. You know, they're kind of like prop characters, but you hope that they're well fleshed out and rounded enough that they feel satisfying within the story itself. But using those characters themselves and using them as almost like chess pieces as they were, and kind of saying, well, this character is really interesting. I've made them really interesting. I've had them interact with the main characters. They've fulfilled their purpose, but you've left them there with a little bit of a mystery that you want to kind of leave the audience kind of chomping a little bit at. And doing that allows you to really to push the audience and just kind of say, you know what, there's a little bit more of a story to be sold on this particular part and this particular medium that you can go for. Why not try and trail it there? So it's like leaving a little bit of a few breadcrumbs here and there, and leaving enough so the audience is actually full, but also saying, okay, so here is something else that you can maybe go for. Here's a little bit of another kind of question mark that wasn't entirely answered, and you can fulfill that by going off in this other direction.
Rich, you must do this a lot, I imagine, on the Clancy game, surely.
And a lot of times it simply comes down to putting a throwaway reference there to something that happened off screen, to a shared experience that two of the characters had that isn't in the game, but which is you are placing in the world somewhere. You don't actually have to come up with what happened. You just have to come up with a reference to it. And building those sorts of things in, building those mentions of the world outside the game so it doesn't feel like the game has had the plastic freshly taken off it. That's where I think the successful hook building comes in. Just making references to things that belong in that world that can be filled in later by someone else who comes along with that mandate, as opposed to having to tell the whole story with absolutely everything in it. It's the way to go. And for an example of how not to do it, I would recommend the film Solo, which took absolutely every single hook and answered it. It was so much cooler when we didn't know what the Kessel Run was.
It's true. I liked Solo more than most people. Yes, that's true. Leia, I'll come to you in a second. I was just going to say, I was actually going to give much the same sort of answer to this, and I do this all the time in almost everything I write. I will make offhanded reference to events in the past or places or people that will never be mentioned again, but I hope I do it in an interesting enough way that the reader or the player or the viewer will go, I want to know more about that, as you say, like we all did with the Kessel Run in Star Wars. That's a great example. So Leia, what did you want to say?
I was going to say, like, going off what Corey said, think about your endings. I think about your beginnings or even your pre-beginnings, the planning stage. Really build your world and really take time to create fully fleshed characters and an environment and whatever. And then almost incidentally, when you write, you'll be making offhand reference to stuff you just didn't have time to fit in. And then when it comes to someone else potentially taking on that property, you already have this really clear Bible, as it were, of what the world's supposed to be. So I think if you know from the jump that you want it to be something that will translate into loads of different things, take that time at the beginning to really dig into who your characters are and whatever. And even if it is to the extent of, I don't have time, but I know that there's the secret and I'm not going to figure out what it is, but I know it's there. Just making note of that and having a really clear, just build a world and then tell your one story, and other people will be like, oh, I want to go here in your world and there, because you only had a little bit of it. Just take the time to create a rich world, and then you can take it anywhere.
Miko, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, sure. I think yes, I absolutely agree about just making reference to things like that. That's a very simple and powerful tool, and one upside of that too is that it's very easy to do because you can just make those references and you don't really have to worry about whether they land at all because they're not really designed with that in mind.
Someone else's problem.
Well, yeah, but also something that can generally can be very safely ignored by somebody else if it's not relevant. So it's kind of a freebie. But I think more importantly than that, also just make sure that like whatever you put in, that it's about things other than just the main characters and about just like, so it's not just the kind of thing that you get this feeling that everything that happens in this game like revolves around these characters, so everybody's related to them or interested in what they're trying to do or like trying to oppose them or whatever it might be. Just having characters who are doing their own stuff and really don't give a shit about like what the what the player character might be up to, and don't care about the ongoing conflict or anything. Like they have their own thing happening, and just somehow showing that in the background, whether it's something that you overhear on the radio or just see posters on a wall or something like that. And like there is a bit of an art in doing that in a way that kind of implies that the world is much larger than this slice that we see, without making it feel like it's very artificial. Like I think we've all seen those games where somebody's like painting these highly specific messages on walls that only seem to be making sense if you happen to be a player character in like a very specific circumstance, and that's not really the best way to do it. But the principle of that is correct, and just kind of making it feel like even if you weren't here, there would be stuff going on. Like I think that's a key thing.
Yeah, I think I was maybe would have added onto the world building thing is with that, just caring about all of the characters as much as you do about the main character, because again, I think to make it organic and not make it sort of signposted like, come find out about this person, if you have done the work before, organically it will come out that this is a really interesting person that the protagonist is interacting with, and I want to go find out more about them. We just don't have time here and now, so I'll read your comic or I'll come to your play. But yeah, just make, and I think that's fundamental to good storytelling generally. Make three-dimensional characters, make a world that has rules and makes sense, and then take a slice of it and tell the story. But yeah, just put in that work.
All right, we have a little under 10 minutes left. I'm going to paraphrase questions here. We've had a few questions on sort of broadly the same topic, so I'm just going to paraphrase and rephrase this one myself, which is the question of how do you deal with player action? And by that, I mean what players do in a game. So if we're writing transmedia properties around a core game where the players make choices, how do we account for those choices in the transmedia? And just to kick off the answers, I don't. My answer to that is to simply avoid that wherever possible. And as we said about dealing with things at the edges of a property, just simply don't get involved in those decisions of being able to do this is being able to write a story that makes as much sense regardless of whether the player went left or right at the climax of the game or whatever. It's, that's not easy, but that is part of the skill of writing good transmedia that works around this core property. Corey, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think a lot of writing, and hopefully I'm not speaking out of school here, but a lot of writing is about misdirection at the end of the day. And with video game writing, it's a lot about the illusion of choice. Even with games which have seemingly a lot of choice, they tend to be narrowed and funneled into a point where you're hopefully guiding the player in a way that they feel like they have a choice, but you're kind of funneling down a certain route. There's always going to be a level of freedom that is inherent in video games that you can't control. That's part of the attraction of playing a game, I guess. But I totally agree with you in the sense of really maintaining and sticking to the core of what the story should be about, and having that level of discipline to really create a self-contained story which works on its own, but also has enough, I guess, freedom on the outskirts, on the rim of it, to allow the player and the audience to feel like they have actually participated to a point where their choices actually do mean something. The Telltale games were probably a really good example of being able to play with that illusion of choice. There was obviously a set pattern that was created for each chapter that was there, but they tried to integrate some of the smaller choices and obviously the larger choices into each chapter to at least make it feel like it was tailored to your own individual choices. But even that had, you know, maybe 2 or 3 funnels which were going down that always guided the player down. So it is that kind of like, hey, we've got this thing over here, don't look at this hand over here. So it's really just being able to play with that technique and allowing that sense of making the player feel like they have the illusion of choice.
Absolutely, yeah. Stan Lee always used to talk about the illusion of change in Marvel Comics, and I think in games we do often talk about the illusion of choice in the same way. I am being told that I have to start wrapping things up, I'm afraid. So let's just go to sort of a closing spiel. So thank you to everyone watching. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. And of course, thank you to our panelists. And I'm going to go around you now and ask you all to tell people where they can find you online, your Twitter accounts, that sort of thing. So Corey, what's your Twitter handle?
I'm really easy to remember. It's basically my name, Corey Brotherson. So you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, pretty much everywhere as my own name.
All right, excellent. Richard Dansky, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter as rdansky or at richarddansky.com.
Excellent. Leia Mwangamagui. Leia, are you on Twitter?
I am not. I don't understand it. I am on Instagram. I've got to be honest. I am on Instagram. The Invisible Art is my handle, and then it's theinvisibleart.com is my website.
All right. And Mikko Ratalati, where are you online?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I feel like Leia is the only one of us who has like any sense not being on Twitter. like that's it. I don't think it's improved any of our lives in any way, but you know. However, you can find me on Twitter at Mickey Hill. That's MIKKIHEL. And yeah, I guess that's probably the easiest way to see what's up with me.
Okay. And I've been your host, Anthony Johnston, and you can find my Twitter at Anthony Johnston. I'm not sure if the people watching can see our names here, so I'm going to spell it for you because it's tricky. It's ANTONYJOHNSTON. As long as you spell it right, you'll find me everywhere online. Finally, if you've enjoyed this panel, remember that we are doing these all this week. And there are still limited places still available for the other panels. So tomorrow on Wednesday, Andy Walsh is chairing a panel on the performance of game scripts, which I'm personally looking forward to. I've got my own ticket for that one. Then on Thursday, there's a panel on narrative design and how stories work in an interactive environment. And then finally on Friday, there is the world building panel. I'm a panelist on that one, but don't let that put you off. All of these panels are at the same time as this one, in theory, 6 p.m. London time. And you can get links to tickets for all the events at writersguild.org.uk. Go there, follow the link on the front page for the online Festival of Games Writing events, and you'll find the links to get tickets for all of those. So again, thank you, everybody. That is a wrap. Over to you, Andy. He's not ready for me.
Thank you very much. The technical difficulties continue with PowerPoint refusing to do what it's supposed to do, so I can share you the links. But I will be emailing those all out to you after the event. So thank you very much for coming. We've already talked about the panels that are there, and I'll be running over the technical settings to make sure we don't have similar hitches tomorrow. Cross fingers. We will. So thank you very much for your patience. I mean, one of the points in the panel last night was that persistence counts. So thank you for demonstrating that, both as panelists and attendees. Wherever you are, please clap, bang the floor to help me thank the Writers Guild. Thanks Fusebox for sponsoring the event. Thank you for coming along. And thank you for our panelists for their insights and wisdom. With that, I will say adieu. Join us for those future events. You can find them on through the links. And hope to see you at another one of the events soon. Thank you very much and good night.